TÓIBÍN, good morning.
Good morning,
and
Fergus.
Yeah, I want to go straight to The Magician, your most recent book. And there were multiple suicides in man's life. So can you tell me, why did they take place? His two sisters and then his son. So what happened there?
It seems to be something much more part of that milieu of neurotic Germans, both before and after the war. And that suicide was much more part of the age. Although it might just be that it hasn't touched me, but because in Ireland it really has been really prevalent. But he's, one of his sisters really, like a lot of people in the German inflation period, I'm talking about the 20s, simply had no money. They simply ran out of road. Their pensions were zero, and one of his sisters was also a morphine addict, and she couldn't handle that at all. And the earlier sister it was a love affair that she was an actress who wanted to be a settled, respectable person, but knowing that when she was settled and respectable, she would want to be an actress.
Right.
And those sort of tensions in her caused suicide as well. And then his son Klaus. It was a very difficult period for Germans who had been in exile during the Second World War. When the war was over, it was not as though Germany welcomed them all home with open arms. They hadn't been through the bombing, they hadn't been through the experiences. It was as though they were sunning themselves in California while the Germans were suffering.
Right.
And they noticed, people who came back in, that Germans who had been involved in the Nazis were being rehabilitated. And so all this affected Klaus Mann very deeply. And he also was addicted to morphine and perhaps some other drug. And so that he was down in the south of France, absolutely miserable, and he wasn't working. He was homosexual, but Germany didn't want him back. And so he also committed suicide.
Right. Staying on the family side of things, I want to ask you about Yeats's father. And I have a quote from you here. I hear with some alarm that he is writing a play in which, as it is the most highly technical of all literary forms, he will most certainly not succeed. So was Yeats's father jealous of his son? Why was he so pessimistic about his son's work? And he also left. You said when his son was getting some influence. So was he just
it's one of those,
he didn't believe in him, or why was that?
Yeah, it's one of those strange father-son relationships where Yeats's father could do everything really except work. And he couldn't finish a painting. If he would start a painting in spring, it would be useless because the summer would have come. It would change all the colours. And, when he married first, he was a barrister. It looked as though he would have a great career as a lawyer, and he would possibly become a judge. And he married a woman from a very, wealthy commercial shipping family in Sligo. And she presumed she was going to have this very comfortable life with him. Well, he decided he wanted to be a painter, and he went off to London to train. And he was never good at selling his work. He was never good at finishing his work, and he had these 4 children. And their summers were spent in Sligo simply because there was nothing in London for them to do. Jack, the youngest, spent really between the ages of about 5 and 15 most of his life in Sligo, including the winters. The wife grew very melancholy, but what W. Yeats, as the eldest child, did was he became a worker from very early on. He became someone who delivered poems, essays, lectures. He became famous in his 20s, as his father increasingly just didn't finish things. And his father was also a great talker. So in about, 1907, 1908, when one of the daughters was going to America, the father decided that he would go to America just to see it. And then when he was there, he decided he wasn't coming home. And nothing they could do could make him come home. I mean, he's 68 years old. He has no source of income. He's living in a boarding house, and he will not come home. And how he's paid for it is that W. Yeats keeps these manuscripts of his poems, which he sells to John Quinn in New York. And Quinn goes down to the boarding house and pays the bills. And so the son is paying for the father. The son is becoming a great finisher of poems and a famous figure, including a playwright. And the father is just talking, telling his life story, because he's in a boarding house, meaning there are new people coming. but he loves that because he can tell his whole story again. But he is a seriously great talker, and his letters are marvellous. But he's not. But the relationship between father and son certainly changed very much, and we have all the evidence because we have all the letters.
Right.
And the biography of him is called Prodigal Father because he's prodigal father.
Right. So he was less mature than his son in many ways, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah. Oh, very much so.
Yeah. To go back to when we just talked about the 1980s in Irish journalism, you were editor of McGill before falling out with Vincent Brown. So what happened in your case, if you don't mind me asking? You don't know.
I mean, you fell out with Vincent regularly. I mean, there would be a final straw. Everything felt like a final straw. And as he pointed out, he was one of those strange owners. I mean, he owned the magazine, and he was editor of the Tribune, and I was the editor. And of course, yes, of course there was editorial freedom. It wasn't as though he was sort of a Rupert Murdoch trying to protect commercial interests. He didn't have any commercial interests. And his aim was to make the magazine really matter. And his aim was idealistic. It was to make people in power accountable, and to do so with flair and skill so that the magazine would matter every month. The pressures were enormous. We didn't have, the only staff member was Jean Kerrigan. So you just didn't have, for example, I had nobody in the Dáil. You were trying to work all the time trying to find freelance people who would do certain things for you, but all the time every month you needed a story.
Right.
You needed a story that would be on the radio, you needed a story that would be on the cover, you needed a story that everyone would be talking about, and that would sell the magazine, everyone had to go and get the magazine. It's really hard to do that every month, especially in a time when politics are stable. So when I came in as editor, Gareth Fitzgerald's government also came in, and they were there as a stable government for all the time I was there. It wasn't as though there were new elections or
heaves and this and that.
Yeah, so there were, exactly, there were heaves. So there was always pressure to deliver, and no matter who it had been in my job, and in fact I lasted longer than the other people who came after me. There were going to be big long meetings with Vincent saying, like, where are the articles on Charlie Hoy's finance, and he would list all the things, and the meetings could be very long and very brutal and very personal. And he had a thing he used to say. He said, "Colm, the problem with the magazine is not that it's bad. That's not the problem. The problem is you don't know it's bad. No, you can't answer that." And eventually, it was partly my fault in that there was a cover of the magazine that I didn't think. I had to make a decision on a Monday night over a cover. The designers were saying one cover wasn't working, and it wasn't working, some new cover. So we put a story that wasn't substantial enough on the cover, which McGill doesn't do. And I was on sale, it was a Christmas issue, and I was on sale for far too long, and people bought it and were disappointed by it. And it was my decision, it was my fault. And I remember thinking at the end of that, I'm going to go, because if that cover is such a disaster, and it isn't as though I can say I have the next 5 covers in my head. I should just go.
You're fighting fire.
And so I remember one day saying to him, I think I should go, and he we all got over it, but it was.
I don't think you'd be the only one to have a difficult conversation with him, but he has a ferociousness, doesn't he, or a ferocity? Where do you think he got that?
That he wasn't like anybody else. There was a huge complacency in journalism then, and everybody thought it'll be fine, everything will be fine. And if, some of the press conferences for the election campaign, people would literally ask Charlie Hoy, "How do you think you're going to do in the marginals, Mr. Hoy?"
What does that mean, the margins?
In constituencies where the last seat would be up for grabs.
Right.
Ask him, how do you think he was going to do it? What do you think he was going to say? That there was...
Nothing questions.
Whereas Vincent was completely challenging. He was... he had an extraordinary sort of physical presence. It wasn't just that he was very good looking, which he was, but that he had a way of holding himself in a room. He wore a suit. And tie. He tended to be very formal in the way he was. But the questions were really sharp.
Right.
And he delivered them in a very special way. He would have made a great barrister.
Mm.
And that's really, he wanted to be a barrister sometimes. But his politics were interesting. He was on the reform wing of Fine Gael, which of course I thought was the funniest. It was a...
What did they stand for? Reform wing of Fine Gael as opposed to Fine Gael?
Being nice to the poor.
Right. So he was trying to basically make Fine Gael left right wing. Is that basically
That's correct. Yeah.
Right.
I thought this was tremendously funny.
Right.
By the way.
You mean just waste of time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's not what they're into.
yeah.
Yeah. So what was your finest moment in journalism specifically? Obviously you've written these great books and been successful, but do you have a highlight of your
I
journalistic?
suppose that after McGill, I wrote the book about the border.
Right.
Walking on the border. You know, I thought that book was that book stands up. You
Right.
know, and that book, yeah, it was my project. You know, but I mean, there were moments in McGill. There were individual issues in McGill, which were pretty good, and trying to make a lot of trying to get the balance of the magazine right. So you had political stories and, you know, sports stuff and art stuff. Trying to make it into a package that really people would if you're going to Tralee on the train, it would be a marvelous thing to have. That'd just be my idea.
Right. So, having listened to you speak and speaking to you now, you seem like just pretty happy with life, and you seem to enjoy life and enjoy your life. And it seems to me, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that many of your contemporaries in Irish journalism, they seem to have like an agitatedness and a zeal to right the wrongs of the world. And you just seem a bit more content or something. And I wonder, do you think that's fair? And maybe could it be that your writing of fiction is like a therapeutic outlet or something? Like, if you didn't have this, do you think you'd be furious all the time?
I mean, I am.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Journalists in general, they have a bone to pick with people. You know, I don't get that sense from you.
So you know, when I left McGill, I was 30, and meaning that I was really young when I was appointed, and that left me absolutely free, because you can't really start writing a novel for the first time if you're a man over about the age of 35. There's no evidence of people doing that.
Wow.
Things strangely solidify in you. And if you haven't done that work, if you haven't been working with your imagination and writing this down by 35, say you really won't do it. You've had every chance you won't do it.
Right.
Women are different because they haven't been given the chances in the same way. So, but by the time I left McGill in 1985, I had written most of a first novel.
Right.
And the job was then to write the border book, write a book about Barcelona, finish the first novel and write a second novel. And I grew into a state where I was driven, where I needed to finish these things because there really wasn't anywhere else to go. It wasn't as though I wanted to go and work in a newsroom.
Right.
And it wasn't as though anyone wanted me particularly to work in a newsroom. I was working freelance. I was doing stuff, you know, for the Sunday Indo. I was being well paid with it. That part was all fine. But the main work moved to write these books.
Right.
And to write those books, you had to be driven. Because you could stop writing them halfway through. And you could really just go drinking or just get on with your friends.
Play some tennis or whatever.
Yeah, play some tennis. And really, really had to push myself all the time to do this work. And that became my life then. And, you know, so I didn't get involved in the day-to-day business again.
Right.
And then on one of the books I made some money. So,
right.
You know, it was an easier. It was a funny period around 1990 to publish your first novel because a lot of people it's just like now. A lot of people in Ireland were publishing first novels. So there's a sort of group of people who included Roddy Doyle, Sebastian Barry, Anne Enright, and many others really. And so that's what I did.
Right. You had the same English teacher as John Banville. He's a bit older than you, but what did that man teach you, if anything? Do you think that you got something from him, or is that just a coincidence?
He was very nice. You see, I had been with Christian Brothers, and they, no matter what you did, they called you an imbecile.
Right.
They treated you like dirt, and they just presumed you're from a small town, and you had to be sort of nobody. And when I went to boarding school, age 15, to the diocesan boarding school, the famous St. Peter's, first essay I wrote, Father Larkin just said to me, you know, you can write. And it's an unusual thing to be able to do. It's not, you know, you might say natural to you, it isn't. And you've got to watch that and work with it. So it was really nice to me, anything I did. And there was a Latin teacher called Mr. Power, and I began to give Mr. Power my poems. And so I would put poems under the door for Mr. Parry, he'd read them, he would read nicely. And it was a sports school, big GAA school, and it didn't bother anyone that I didn't play GAA, and they just said, well, during sports, all that sports stuff, I said, well, it could be in the library. I said, would you do that? Because I would, of course, do that.
You have to do something.
Yeah, but there were but there were no problems about that. I mean, I went to the library, and that's what everyone knew I did. And so, I mean, they left me alone, basically, to write poetry and to write essays and read books. And it was a pretty brutal place in a lot of ways. And later on, with the Fergus report, we learned a lot about it. But my experience there was good.
And what about Banville's? Have you spoken to him about this?
Yeah, Father Larkin was just took things very slow, and texts, but had a sort of seriousness about them. I mean, worked with you as though this wasn't just about getting an exam. There were things you could learn from this, and he worked with the exams. So he's a practical fellow, but he also seemed to me to have a rich sensibility of his own. I mean, like a lot of English teachers, that he had his own relationship to these books, and but he says that Banville could write like that when he was 15. He could write a Banville sentence when he was 15, and Banville felt the same about him. I mean, it wasn't as though he shaped us both to become novelists.
Right.
It was as though he introduced us both to books in a sort of serious way, and which his own reading was serious, and he just was a serious fellow.
Right.
Yeah.
That's lovely. So I want to ask you, I often ask people, what's the moral of the story, right? In a sort of a childish way, and sometimes that answer isn't obvious. With Brooklyn, I want to ask you that question. What is the moral of the story, if there is one?
There isn't one, you see.
Right.
Because if you start writing morals to stories, you start writing parables.
Right.
And you start losing something that's absolutely vital in a novel, which is a sense of moral drift, rather than a moral certainty or
direction.
Direction. That, in other words, leave that aside, what's right or wrong, and you presume a wrong act, say, in a novel is good because it's dramatic, and you're looking for drama all the time. It's not that a wrong act the reader will condemn this and feel they know their moral position more, or see the difference between right and wrong. That we take, for example, Ailish coming home and deciding not to tell them she's married.
Right.
Well, what I want to do is work with that, just to see the amount of trouble this is going to cause her. But the reader sees that this is one strategy that she can develop in order just to get home. But I'm not interested in the moral question, really, at all.
Right.
And if I was, I would think I would lose the novel.
Right. And would you say that in general?
You mean in life?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't, because I would think that the attack on Ukraine is wrong.
Right. So why is that wrong?
Oh, but see, if I was writing a novel,
right,
I would show the extraordinary pandemic for a germaphobe, and Putin becoming more and more paranoid as the pandemic is going on, so that we see him building up into this fella.
Right.
That's a novel.
Right.
But in ordinary life, moral questions arise all the time, and
right.
Even missing a deadline, is a moral question. You should not have missed a deadline. But I think you're better to leave them out of novels, and highly developed moralists don't write novels.
Right. What's something that people might know that you do? Do you have any funny quirks or rituals or habits or routines or anything like that?
I suppose the tennis would be one. I mean, I haven't written a novel about tennis.
Right.
Nobody has really, have they? Good novel.
A novel. There was a film called Wimbledon. Do you remember that?
Oh, bad. Yeah.
I don't know. Is that a book or?
Was it a Woody Allen film?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
But
your tennis is something.
Yeah, in recent years, especially in Los Angeles. I mean, I'll go to Los Angeles next week for the spring break.
Right.
And it's become. There's something I can do in tennis. I mean, I'm no good, but I won't ever let a ball go by and run after anything. And,
right.
I mean, it just is. No matter what comes, I'll be over there, and I'll be back over here.
Right.
And Whereas I'm really intrepid, and I'm useless as well. I've no style.
So there's something I noticed. You spoke about being upset, not having won the Booker Prize, and
I didn't win it 3 times.
Right.
But I think one of the times I was upset.
Right. And without thinking, I never would have thought of artists or writers as competitive. But they are. Why wouldn't they be? Do you know what I mean? Can you talk a bit about that instinct?
Yeah, that
they do want recognition.
Your book is coming out in a given season, and there are other books coming out in that season, and a book can really fall through the cracks very, very easily. A novel can, whereas just nobody's paying any attention to it, and it can happen with a novel that you think is going to do really well.
Right.
For some, you're very good as a novelist at thinking yourself up, at thinking this novel, because somehow you've been writing it, it's been exciting you, and publishers are good at helping you. This is going to be, and a novel can simply be a flop. I mean, and if it's a flop, you're at home watching someone else's book,
right,
getting movie rights or becoming a bestseller or winning the Booker Prize, and but the Booker Prize evening itself is designed towards creating, well, stress isn't the word because it's much more than that. And it is purely competitive. I mean, there's 6 novelists and one of them has to win and the others have to lose. And there are 6 TV crews with their cameras right in your face trying to eat your dinner. And with TV lights. And the minute you lose, they turn the lights off and they want you to go and they want the winner to,
Right.
And you've just written a book. So it really isn't ordinary because the speech is designed to create drama. In other words, it's a long speech by someone before the winner is announced.
Right.
And you have to sit there with the TV camera in your face. And so it's not a way. I mean, it really is not a. Consider novels are written in quietness. The whole point, you need a lot of silence. You need a very dull life to write a novel. And this is not dull. I mean, this is really disturbing. And the fact that you can see the other writers and you can see their table, and then there's a big cheer, and then so I've lost that 3 times. I didn't mind. I really didn't mind the first time because I was glad to be on the short list, and I didn't mind the last time because my book was very short and I didn't think it was going to win. But the middle time, there was a lot of tension.
You thought you had a chance.
I did.
Yeah.
And I didn't win. And it's probably the way they used to talk when we were young in Ireland about character, that it was character forming.
So did you think that was true in this case?
No,
it wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't anything. It was just. I mean, it was just so disturbing, and
wow.
it was like someone had decided to put you into boiling water or something. It was all fizzle. It was all, and you were realizing you were dealing with the fizzle end of the writing process, where it's so far away from writing this, but yet it was becoming an important part of it because the whole marketing business of books was becoming really serious in these years. People are putting huge amounts of effort into, like, to get a book on a table in an important bookshop, you paid, which meant that people always thought, well, that's what the bookshop thinks is important. No, that's what someone paid. So those things became really important. Discounting books, 3 for the price of 2, all those sort of things became part of the deal in those years.
Right.
And there was a lot of pressure on writers to deliver not only a book, but a sort of version of themselves personally that might be acceptable to the wider public.
Right.
In other words, doing readings, interviews, TV documentaries, and all sorts of things, that you became your own publicist. And a lot of people did this.
I want to ask you about the American versus Irish way of expressing love to family members. So, for example, I wrote down a couple of quotes on the phone. Ada says, goodbye, Mammy, and the Mammy says, goodbye, Eileen. And I was thinking, in America you'd hear, love you, or, we don't really do that in Ireland.
Yeah,
so what's going
that
on there?
whole language of the easy language of familial love, people in Ireland, I mean, fathers wouldn't do it.
And similarly, on a similar sort of note, you may have heard Bono's anecdote about the man in the mansion on the hill. Have you heard him talk about that? He basically says, in America, you see the man in the mansion on the hill and they think, one day if I work really hard, I could live in that mansion. Do you think that's fair? To
I don't think that you could win the approval of all your fellow citizens by living in a mansion on a hill. I don't think that's
in Ireland.
In Ireland. I don't think that's
what in America.
Yes, and I don't think that's what people admire most in Ireland, and that it sets people apart in a funny way, and there are good historical reasons for that.
So it's the fact that we were poor, would you say, is why we might resent that. The fact that Irish people were poor for a long time.
Yeah, and that the fellow who was living on the in the house on the hill was a landlord. I think things have changed to some extent in that some of those .com millionaires or people like that have become sort of respected people. But there is a funny suspicion of grandeur in Ireland and of ostentatious wealth that people just feel people have got above themselves, whereas in America there's never really any problem with that.
No.
I mean, it's nice being here sometimes. You just don't have the other thing at all.
So Eilish's mother said to her that she should wear nothing too American. That's another example. Can you give me an example of something someone might do in Ireland that is too American? Like, would it be an expression of wealth, or
but it would be
what's something someone might do that might embarrass them?
Well, it would be the constant saying of, in the States we don't, that fridge. No, in the States, you see, we have an ice box that has that car. No, in the States we have you can but it would be for a woman. It would be, of course, wearing certain colours, and that's all changed now because everything that's available in Ireland. But in the 50s, sunglasses would be just an obvious one. Some people would have sunglasses, but a lot of people wouldn't.
Wow.
And just wouldn't wear them.
Isn't it funny now? You think of Americans, I think, as dressing badly compared to Europeans.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
And probably compared to I don't know the Irish people.
Yeah, that's turned around, but in the 50s it certainly wasn't
completely different. Yeah. Okay. So what stereotypes do you think Irish people have about America? Are there any that you would contend with?
I think everybody has a real trouble in Ireland with Republicans. I just don't understand how there could be such things. And
that's so true.
And they just their whole version of America is about freedoms. And but to try and explain a Republican.
So how do you explain that?
I mean, to try. Well, I lived in Texas, so a lot of people were Republicans,
right.
And they were, I played tennis with them.
They're not monsters,
and not monsters, but that element of America, the really right wing, nasty, the prison system, all that sort of punitive nastiness. All of that's very hard to explain in Ireland because I don't think
the guns.
The guns. I mean, nobody has any. People just presume that some of those shootings that there would be then change, that Sandy Hook or one of those things would result in change, and it didn't. Yeah, so there are all those elements of sort of red state flyover elements that make no sense at all. I mean, down where you live and stuff would make no. And also, while there's mild racism in Ireland, serious racism makes no sense in Ireland either.
And it does here in a different way, or it's more balanced, right?
People don't want black people to vote. I mean, that's what people don't want black people to vote here, and they do everything to stop.
I think still there are people who
gerrymandering systems and gerrymandering systems are done so that I know they're Democrats, but effectively in a lot of those places it's a black vote they're trying to stop.
Okay, so you've said that you need to be a monster to write, and I think what you're referring to is you have to steal bits of people's lives and without their permission, basically. Take their stories.
But that's a bit crude. I mean that sometimes with Eilish's mother is going to be left behind on her own in Ireland, and you're going to dramatise that, and you're going to see her in that situation. You're going to put her into shock. You're going to write that down. I mean, your sympathy for it is of no interest. What's of interest here is just getting it right, where the reader will realise the enormity of what's going to happen to her. And I mean stuff like that where you're dealing with a pain and you're dramatising and you're building it up and you're creating images of it. They're using people who don't do that. So I've been used, I write about myself sometimes, and then obviously if I do that I write about the family. And this started early, where the first story I published, I think I had a woman, she had a lot of children, and she put all the knives and forks in the middle of the table. You know, she didn't set the table.
Right.
Got all the knives and forks, put them, and you could take them if you want. My mother did this, and she really was annoyed about the story. She said people were going to realise it was her, and that I'd taken one, thing that was sort of private. I said, you shouldn't have done it then. Like, it was your own fault. I wanted an image for someone busy at a table, and I had one ready made. Thanks, it was due to you. So let's stop annoying me.
But at the start of a film or at the start of a book, it says any resemblance to actual events or locales or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Why do they say that if it's not true?
For legal reasons. I mean, to protect themselves, just to get the first bit of a court case over. To say, well, no, we didn't base it on anything.
So it's not true when they say that.
No, it's not true.
Okay, I never really knew that until I saw it at the start of Brooklyn, and I said, "Is this some sort of joke?"
Yeah.
That they just. Okay, I want to ask you about your time in Venice. You have a hilarious quote about the man you saw in the museum. Do you know what I'm talking about? And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it. Is that okay? So, or maybe you should read it. Would that be okay? There you go.
For one glistening moment, my inner little fascist emerged. I stood in the doorway until I caught his eye. It seemed to me that he was Italian. I signalled to him that he should put on his mask. Ruefully he did so. While I felt the glow that only self-satisfaction can bring, he would hate me for the rest of his days.
Thank you for reading that. How has your life changed in the last 2 years in terms of the way you view people? Like an instance like that, could that happen again? Or have you kind of softened a bit with all of that? Or have you had experiences yourself of all of this stuff?
I think it's a big issue now on the subway here in New York. We were talking about, is it the 1st of March today?
Today, yeah.
That the rule is that everybody wears a mask. So you think, well, everyone should wear a mask. But in every carriage, there's someone not wearing a mask. And they're standing there absolutely as though they have a right not to wear a mask, which they don't have. I mean, the rule is on the subway you wear a mask. And so that's, it just depends on the person. If I'm in a good enough mood, and if I feel the person is not going to, I just will go. But I noticed nobody else does it, that these people are just simply left alone. And I did say to someone the other day, could you just move away a bit, because you're not wearing a mask? And, but I didn't do it too much. And, the Venice thing was strange because there was almost no one in those museums. It was a window, and it was about a week, where you could freely fly into Venice. I mean, you had to do a PCR test before you went, and that had to be negative. Then you could fly into Venice. And the churches and museums were all open, and the hotels were open, and the restaurants were open. But there was no one in Venice. So it was the strangest time.
Right.
My only rule was that I wouldn't go into a restaurant. I would sit outside, and I wore a mask all the time. And I didn't get COVID. But in retrospect, it was probably a bit stupid place to go. So
do you think, have you felt scared over the last 2 years about this?
Not
phenomenon?
Really. I felt early on that you weren't as likely to get in airplanes as it might suggest. So I flew a bit, but I didn't do too much.
Right.
But a lot of the time I was in LA, and I was working, and I wrote a book of poems.
So you're busy.
So my book of poems, Vinegar Hill, is coming out this month.
Lovely.
And those poems were written in the pandemic.
Right.
So I did something useful that I hadn't done before, and I have a lot of it. I did a lot of work, but what I did more than anything else was we sort of. I was living with my boyfriend, and we got on very well, and we had nice days, and we just were a very quiet couple who didn't want to see anyone and didn't we were just quite happy.
So you had a relatively pleasant experience.
I did.
The last while,
yes, I did, and a lot of people didn't. So
right. You're conscious of that.
I think living on your own with the idea that day after day after day will go without all the props that you need if you're living on your own, which is I suppose it's coming.
We all need that.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, I assume you must have got some pushback with the Testament of Mary from people who thought it was outrageous, in that it was contrary to what they believe to be true. Have you experienced that on a personal level, or do people? What has it been like? Obviously,
I think it tells you a lot about Ireland. the play was on in the Project Art Centre in Dublin. It had Marie Mullen, who was a old Druid actress. I mean a vintage Druid actress, and so her performance was not one to challenge Catholics. She was in the part. She was living the part, so that it was. You watched her. She wasn't just doing something to your religion. She was trying to embody this story, and the only thing that happened was that a well-known priest who I knew came to one of the preview nights, and I was going up. I saw him there, and it was sitting at the end of her. I said, knelt down, as I should indeed, and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I just wanted to see what you were doing." He was very good humoured about it, and on the way out, I thought he was trying to get by me actually, but he didn't succeed. And I said, "That was lovely. That was really very nice." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I'll tell you, my hearing isn't great, so I didn't hear much of it, but I like looking at it." Meaning, if you think I'm going to denounce your play, I'm not. Like, this is not the way the church works. But in other words, that is a very Irish way of handling that. You don't confront it. You go to the side. You say something funny and you go. And it's been on in every country, the play, and it hasn't really caused any trouble anywhere.
Wow. I would have thought in America that these calls.
Yeah, there were. When I opened on Broadway, there were protests, but they didn't really know what it was. I mean, they thought it was a film, and they came up. They were bussed up from Pennsylvania, so it wasn't a spontaneous. And they didn't get into the theatre. They didn't buy tickets. So there was no disruption ever of a performance of that, even in Mexico.
In Venice, you wrote about Tintoretto's Crucifixion, among other paintings. I read your chapter about the Sign of the Cross last night. You've written the Testament of Mary, and I'm curious as to how do you view the Christian story? Do you view it as purely an interesting sort of myth, or do you think this just sort of happened? Or can you make... Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Can you make a...
I mean, it governs the last 2,000 years for us. And so you can't just say it was nothing, And how it spread is astonishing. And figures like St. John, St. Paul are figures in history. I mean, the resurrection seems to me sort of cheesy in some way,
Literally too good to be true.
Yeah, but the raising of Lazarus, of course, is a very big one, because if you can bring the dead back, then everything's possible. Right. It only happens once in the New Testament, and I think it's only in St. John's Gospel. That's the one that really, when I was writing the Testament of Mary, really struck me. And I have given it a lot of space because it's just so enormous. But the whole question of truth, the whole question is, did God intervene in history? Directly. And that's the big question. And it is a very large leap of faith for me to think that he did. But my parents thought he did.
You're not so sure?
No.
Okay, let me ask you one more thing and then I'll shut up. Sort of related to the last question, not really, maybe. But do you ever sort of meditate or pray or stare into space, daydreaming? Because it seems like, I can imagine your mind being busy all the time. Do you ever just slow down and think about nothing?
Yeah, and in a way that's what the poems came from, because there were long days in the pandemic. And because it was California, they were bright days, so I listen to music a lot. So
what kind of music?
Chamber music and religious music. I listen to a lot of religious music, from Bach to Beethoven to Brahms to all those big masses and Bach cantatas, and so I have a lot of lying around doing nothing. I do, yeah.
As busy as you are.
Yeah, you need to finish things, but I think going around being a busy bee, you can make a terrible nuisance of yourself, being busy.
So you're not that.
I don't think so, no.
Right.
No.
Well, Colm TÓIBÍN, thank you.
Okay,
For talking to us.
Fergus, thank you.
You're a bit of a
Okay, got to be
You are listening to the Logos broadcast with Fergus James Murphy.